Okay, thanks for coming out tonight. Just a couple logistical things as we begin. The first is, if you're unfamiliar with this space, we do have the bathrooms over here to my left and to your right. There's also some materials on the front table as you come in, and those materials as you came in have things like our seminary magazine, for instance, and some comment cards, opportunities to indicate possible topics for a future lecture. So, and then of course, if you didn't already notice, we do have coffee and of course cookies. So those are available afterwards as well. So it's my great privilege to be able to introduce Dr. Reyes this evening. Dr. Reyes, Dr. Jonathan Reyes, is the Senior Vice President for Evangelization and Faith Formation for the Knights of Columbus. And this is a role that he recently took on. Previously, he was the Assistant General Secretary for Integral Human Development for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Executive Director for the Justice, Peace, and Human Development Department. Before his work began in Washington, D.C., he helped co-found Christ in the City and also the very well-known Augustine Institute. He served as President and CEO of Catholic Charities in the Diocese of Denver and served as Vice President for Focus, and was also professor and academic vice president at Christendom College. So wonderful experiences of ecclesial leadership and service. In terms of his academic background, he was Rackham Graduate Fellow at the University of Michigan, and then also completed doctoral studies in intellectual history from the University of Notre Dame. And so he's a very frequent speaker at all kinds of Catholic events, takes them all over the United States, and we're delighted that he is here this evening to be with all of us. So welcome, Dr. Reyes.
So my academic background means I really enjoy hearing myself speak, so I'm going to set the timer so that I don't go too long. It's a delight to be here. Thank you, Reverend Fathers, guests, all you who've come voluntarily, and you, dear men, who have come because this is your mandatory recreation time, I understand. I think they're starting your penance a little early if this is what they're calling recreation. But I promise you to make it well worth it, so you will suffer this evening. I'll just hit start on this. It's a delight to be here. It's also a delight to be here to see one of my former students, Father Tony Stevens, who now does formation here. Tony and I knew each other way back in Christendom days, and I'm glad he's doing formation now. He's really come a long way. Back then, we used to play a lot of basketball together, and he used to be really intimidated by my height. So he seems to have overcome that, except in the presence of the rector. So it's so good to be here. I'm delighted. What I'd like to do this evening is give you a formal lecture. We'll hopefully keep it to about 40 minutes, and then we can have time for questions. I hope it sparks some questions. And take a slightly different approach to John Henry Newman than is normally taken in a Newman talk. I am not a Newman expert, but I have been reading Newman for 30 years of my life, and certainly dear friends with people who are experts and have read a bit about him, but he's been a source of inspiration for the different kinds of work I've done. So I started as an academic. We launched a number of apostolates, and then at a certain point in my life, I decided that I really wanted to actually step away from academics, so I stepped down as president of the Augustine Institute and I did a sabbatical teaching assignment while I was discerning my next move, because I really wanted to serve the poor, to put it simply. Some of that was definitely Catholic guilt. I was raised a Catholic. But a lot of it was my own experience. I grew up in South America, in Caracas, Venezuela. And as a young boy going down to Caracas, and when I went down there, Caracas was like the model country of Latin America. It was doing quite well. And you'd fly in, if you go to Caracas, you fly in and you land at sea level, but the city itself is up in a valley. So you have to drive through the mountains. And you usually flew at night, just when the timing of the flights, et cetera, from when we were getting there from Michigan, where I was born. And we'd get down there, we'd land on the coast, and it's the middle of the night, and you came out, and you came through the tunnels, and you came into the city, and the whole city, a population of something like 4 million at the time, was lit up. It looked like a giant Christmas tree, all the mountains around the valley. And I remember saying to the guide who was also driving us, and I said, boy, this is amazing. It's like Christmas here, and I was just a kid. I said, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And he said, well, just wait till the morning. Wait till the morning. So sure enough, the next morning you wake up, and where you saw all these lit up mountains, you realize were what they called the ranchitos. These are the shanty towns, or what do you want to call them? These are people coming in from the countryside trying to make a living. Cardboard, up against billboards. And I asked very naively as a kid, I said, well, how do they get electricity up there? And the guy said, well, they steal it. They just cut into the wires. And I said, isn't that kind of dangerous? And he said, yes, people die frequently doing it. And often they won't send a father up. If the father has some sort of employment, they'll send one of the kids up, because if they lose the father, they lose their employment. I share that story only to give you a little sense of what has sort of moved me in the last decade of my life, a little more than that, to leave academics and to step into this other space. It's the kind of experience that leaves a mark on one's imagination that's part of you. And I bring it up also because to explain me a little bit, to give you a little context, but also to say this is something that Newman is going to appeal to time and time again, namely the power of a word he used somewhat usefully, imagination. My Thomists are bristling right now. But the imagination as a tool for, as a description of that which happens in us when we make a reality that we encounter not just notional, not something we know, but something that's real for us and lives in us. And this was a key insight of Newman, and I'm going to go after it tonight. The title of my talk this evening is St. John Henry Newman and the Apostolate in the Modern World. There's any number of ways we could have gone at Newman. We could have looked at his books. He's written quite a few of them, and they're still read. He's recently canonized. We could treat him for his virtue, his holiness, talk about what he is just as a model of being a Christian. We could talk about some of his literary accomplishments, as literary accomplishments. Lead Kindly Light is still put to music. It's still sung in various renditions, some better than others. We could also just point to sort of curious ways that Newman has left an influence and relevance in the couple thousand Newman centers throughout the United States, and what it means that Newman's name is invoked there and how that affected things. But I'd like to argue for sort of a different kind of Newmanian relevance. I'd like to suggest that Newman is among our best guides for understanding the world we are currently inhabiting and the kind of response the church needs to make to it. I want to point to his relevance specifically as a source of pastoral and evangelistic wisdom for our time, a kind of apostolic strategist for the modern age. Many people don't think of Newman as a strategist. They mainly know him from his books or perhaps from his conversion story. But even a brief overview of what he accomplished in his lifetime, including but going well beyond his writings, indicates that we are here dealing with not only a literary genius, but a master strategist and tactician. Let me just take a few minutes to sort of list the Newman accomplishments. First literary, but then what he did. Most people don't know all the things he did. The number of movements he started, the thousands of people he influenced, the projects he was involved in. So let's just begin by considering some of his literary accomplishments. Newman, whose life, as you well know, spanned the 19th century, he was given a place along such people in his day as Dickens, Carlyle, Ruskin, Thackeray, as one of the greatest English stylists ever to live. Matthew Arnold, the 19th century's most famous literary critic, thought Newman's prose to be at the height of English expression. Newman, as I said, was a noted poet. His Lead Kindly Light, when put to music, was the most popular hymn of the late Victorian period. And this was something I had to learn, and Queen Victoria's personal favorite. His poem, The Dream of Gerontis, was given operatic form by England's premier composer, Edward Elgar, in 1900. As Newman was working out his approach to Catholicism, he wrote the essay on the development of doctrine, a work that continues to bring people into the church down to our time, and is certainly much discussed these days, given recent conversations. Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua, his defense of his own life and his conversion, was published in weekly installments in 1864 and at the time garnered the attention of the whole nation. It was immediately classed as a work for the ages and given a place among a small handful of religious autobiographies like Augustine's Confessions, a judgment that has not since been altered. Finally, the Victorians were great readers of sermons, a special literary form among them. It was said that Newman's many volumes of sermons so dominated the field that when they first began to be published, no one bought any others. They were comparable to the earlier novels of Sir Walter Scott in their literary dominance. So this is his literary accomplishment, and people tend to know that. Someone who knows something about Newman knows something about that. But let me highlight some of the things he actually accomplished and why I mean he's a strategist and a tactician. And these are highlights. These are not by any means all the things he did. First, I might mention his work as an Oxford tutor at Oxford University. During his 20s, he was actually distinguished in this office because he insisted that being a tutor at Oxford was a pastoral office as well as an academic one. He actually kind of started a revolution in the way the whole university started talking and thinking about what it meant to be a tutor, to take on the actual care of these young people as opposed to just helping them pass exams for a fee. He caused some trouble. Where Newman went, things tended to go. People liked him or didn't. When you met Newman, you knew you met somebody, whether you liked him or not. He was a great teacher. His door was open to students. He was still a young man. By his preaching and personal character of his vision of being a tutor, Newman exercised a kind of spell over the University of Oxford that William Gladstone, one of England's great prime ministers, thought was greater than any university influence since that held by Peter Abelard at the University of Paris in the 12th century. He said that. Somewhere around the same time, Newman was made a deacon in the Anglican Church and first started his pastoral work. The first parish he was assigned to, St. Clement's, was the largest parish in the area, something like 2,000 different homes. He committed when he was made a deacon that he would visit in 1 year every single home if he could. So he's deeply committed to pastoral work, trying to go to 2,000 homes in his first year. He would continue this later, all the way through his life, even late in life, esteemed and much recognized, and still serving, frankly, the poor Irish immigrants to England. In his early 30s, Newman and some colleagues set on foot what came to be called the Oxford Movement, so yet another movement. And he quickly emerged as the movement's key leader, partly by his journalism and writing of sermons, and partly by his tireless energy as he went from village to village, leaving tracts to be read by the local clergy. He was the leading light, the most famous writer of what were called the Tracts for the Times, 90 of which were published in 12 years, many running to the length of books. And here let me offer just a little, I can't help it, because maybe it's because I've spent so much of my life working in committees, especially recently. But Newman revealed some of his tactical genius. One of the people in the Oxford movement had proposed to him that, hey, you know what we should do? We should have every one of us form a committee, and then we'll read all the tracts, and we'll only publish the ones where we all agree on them. Newman had a particular response to that. It went like this, quote, "Living movements do not come of committees. Deliverance is wrought not by the many, but by the few. Not by bodies, but by persons. Committees produce nothing but tame, dull compositions, which will take no one," end quote. Yeah. Of the many things I might say tonight, I suspect that's the least debatable. During this time, he also served as the vicar of St. Mary's. After he served at St. Clement's, he went to the vicar of St. Mary's, which is the Oxford University Church, and he published 8 volumes of his sermons. When he converted to the Catholic faith in his mid-40s, he brought with him several dozen young men who wanted to live religious life with him. So he starts a kind of religious life. With them, he founded 2 oratories of St. Philip Neri, the first in the English-speaking world. In Birmingham, where he lived, he also founded a prep school for boys. Hilar Belloc and later J.R.R. Tolkien both attended it. While founding these oratories, he was asked to found the University of Ireland as well. He spent 6+ years of incessant labor attempting to bring that project to fulfillment, constantly crossing the Irish Sea between the oratory and the university, and producing his masterpiece of educational thought, The Idea of a University, the first half of that. He gave his lectures there. Throughout his life, he also carried on a massive correspondence, advising, evangelizing, teaching, and encouraging a large number of people. People would just write him and ask his advice on what they were thinking, what was going on in the church, what they should do, should they convert, etc. His published letters and diaries run to 32 large volumes of an average of about 500 pages each. Given this, you can see why Benjamin Disraeli, another famous Prime Minister of England, said a full 20 years after Newman's conversion that Newman's leaving was a shock from which the Church of England had not yet recovered. As with all such influential figures, Newman was both greatly admired and greatly feared. Some spoke of him as a kind of early church father who had somehow appeared among them, breathing power and color into what had seemed old and gray doctrines. Others, including some within the Catholic Church, thought him the most dangerous man in England. And all of this took place during a time when England was the most powerful and influential country in the world. A great man in a leading nation at a historically significant time. And yet, I can't help this. In 1890, the obituary of Newman, that was published in the paper of record, the London Times, claimed he had no lasting influence in England and would soon be forgotten. Why? Because, the obituary argued, Newman was an Englishman who was out of step with the spirit of his age. And being out of step, he had proven a failure in the long run. His sermons, according to the columnist, though eloquent, quote, did not reach the masses and did not carry the people of England with him, end quote. In a striking image, the article said that the captain has led the way, but the column lags behind. We do not follow. It ended by consigning Newman to oblivion. Quote, will even the next generation read Newman's now voluminous works? And the implicit answer was, of course not. The obituary ends offering an explanation for this apparent failure, and here's the point I want in bringing this up. Again, this is from the obituary. It was Newman's own choice to be Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. Whether from his ashes will arise the avenger to do for him the work he has not seen done with his own eyes, and so reverse the judgment of time is beyond even conjecture. For the present a mighty man has fallen, and yet we are much as we were, end quote. In other words, the argument is, by setting himself against the currents of the age, which Newman saw rushing toward apostasy and unbelief, Newman had made himself irrelevant. Well, so much for prophecy. Now, a century and more after his death, Newman is the most widely studied and influential man of the Victorian age, and his relevance not only continues but grows. And why is that? And that's where I want to spend the rest of these comments. I'd like to make the argument this evening about one particular aspect of Newman's genius that I believe is worth paying attention to, maybe even more than most people currently are. And that genius had to do with his ability to perceive in the events and developments around him what was likely to be coming in the future, and his practical talent for setting a strategy of thought and action to face those coming challenges. So let's begin by commenting on what Newman saw. What did Newman see when he looked around England? Part of Newman's genius was the ability to get to the root of things. He could identify the assumed first principles present in any given argument or way of looking at the world, and he could see where they were tending. That's how he tended to do most of his argumentative work. He'd reduce it to first principles. He'd get down to where are you starting from. Newman was also steeped in history. Those of you studying history, please continue to do so. He thought in historical categories, and he had a remarkable way of seeing the end of things in their beginnings, how current ideas, principles, and events would likely develop as they move down the years. And many of his predictions, particularly about the nature of faith and belief, have come true. He was in a certain sense prophetic, not in the sense of receiving divine revelation, but in the ability to see conclusions in their origins. So what did he see? When Newman looked at his age, and I am grossly oversimplifying, but I don't think falsifying here. When Newman looked at his age, he saw many things to marvel at, but he also traced certain developments that convinced him that Europe was losing the faith and adopting a false gospel. He saw Europe as heading toward what he called the infidelity of the day. Let me summarize this infidelity for you. First, recall that Newman was born during the Napoleonic era. He grew up at a time when the ideas of the Enlightenment were fresh in men's minds and gaining an ever greater following. He witnessed the consequences of the French revolutionary spirit and the anti-Christian vehemence of many of its adherents. He perceived a growing attitude of glorying in human pride and power based on genuine attainments in the scientific arena, but as we shall see, he believed they went beyond the bounds of an appropriate use of reason. He saw an implicit materialism, a reduction of all reality to what can be seen and measured, in the intellectual trends around him. He saw an implicit faith in progress, a capital P, by which all that had come before, including Christian revelation, was being disregarded as outmoded and irrelevant, detritus in the dustbin of history. These and other observations convinced Newman that a great battle was on the horizon in the West, a battle between radical atheism, a kind of religion of unbelief, and Catholic Christianity. He thought that these were the two fundamental antagonists and that the time was coming when halfway houses between them, like his own Anglican church, would be swept away. As he was to write in the book that described his reasons for becoming Catholic, in these later days outside the Catholic Church, things are tending with far greater rapidity than before to atheism in one shape or another. What a scene, what a prospect does the whole of Europe present at this day. And not only Europe, but every government and every civilization through the world which is under the influence of the European mind. Newman was convinced that the church and the Christian people were not ready for this battle. So through his teaching, preaching, and his apostolic endeavors, he developed a kind of pastoral strategy that was meant to help prepare the church. And because today in the church and the world, the dynamics that Newman perceived are continuing to play out on a grander scale, I would say, Newman's strategy is perhaps just as relevant as it was then as it is for us. So what was his strategic vision? Okay, 5 points. We'll go through them. This way you know he's going to end at some point, and you keep going through them. 5 oversimplifications that hopefully will elicit good questions that we can discuss afterwards. Here are the 5 things I'd like to draw. Number 1, Newman's fight against what he termed rationalism or liberalism in religion, and I'll define those using Newman's definitions. 2, his emphasis on the importance of mystery and the reality of the invisible world. 3, his focus on the intellectual formation of the laity during a time of genuine confusion and competing gospels or worldviews, to use a modern phrase. 4, his appeal to the imagination in evangelization and preaching. And 5, his insistence on a faith that was real. That's the word he kept using for it. That is more than a mere profession of words or just a cultural habit. So number 1, Newman's fight against rationalism. In 1879, at the age of 78, when he was being made a cardinal, Newman gave the often cited summary of his life's work. I'm sure you've heard this quotation before. He said, "I rejoice to say, to one great mischief I have from the first opposed myself. For 30, 40, 50 years I have resisted to the best of my powers the spirit of liberalism in religion. Never did Holy Church need champions against it more sorely than now, when, alas, it is an error overspreading as a snare the whole earth." So what did Newman mean by liberalism? Here's his definition. Now, by liberalism, I mean false liberty of thought, or the exercise of thought upon matters in which, from the constitution of the human mind, thought cannot be brought to any successful issue and therefore is out of place. So he goes on to explain, liberalism then is the mistake of subjecting to human judgment those revealed doctrines which are in their nature beyond and independent of it, and of claiming to determine on intrinsic grounds the truth and value of propositions which rest for their reception simply on the external authority of the divine word. End quote. Revelation, Newman insisted, is something that has come directly from God and upon God's own initiative. And he worried about a growing attempt to deal with Christianity as if there were no special revelation involved, as if its doctrines and duties could be arrived at rationally, were reducible to a sort of philosophy of life, and that whatever could not be arrived at through reason or confirmed by reason needed to be discarded or at least reduced to a mere opinion. He called the reluctance to take the content of revelation as given as the anti-dogmatic principle. In his view, an approach that emptied God's word of its authority and content, or was selective of it, would lead the faith away from being an account of truth and reduce it either to sentiment or a kind of optional moral code. Either way, it was completely personal and it was non-objective. Let me make 2 additional observations just to be sure about something. Number 1, let me be clear, Newman was not against using reason. especially to understand Revelation. He himself believed not only was theology important, it was essential to religion. There's no such thing as religion without theological work. I'd also make this note. Newman viewed liberalism, and here's a nice insight, as not only an intellectual error, that it wasn't just reason being applied in the wrong place, but it was a moral fault as well. The rationalist, he said, makes himself his own center, not his maker. In other words, at the root of liberalism and religion is the sin of pride. This explains Newman's strategic emphasis in his preaching and writing on humility. Humility of mind before the truths of God. Humility is the starting point for strengthening the church against the pride of the age. I'll say a little bit more about that later. Number 2, Newman's emphasis on mystery and the invisible world. One result of the rationalism that we just described that particularly concerned Newman was the loss among Christians of a sense of mystery. This is, of course, fatal to Christianity because mystery is at the center of it, starting with the Trinity and everything that follows. Mysteries in the faith are to be expected, he said, because the foundational truths of the faith, the atonement, the incarnation, the Trinity, to mention only a few, run past the limitations of the finite reasoning mind. They're too big for human reason, as Frank Sheed put it in his famous book, Theology and Sanity. Therefore, the proper response to mystery for Newman is not scientific analysis with a certain amount of skepticism. Rather, the proper response to mystery involves awe, humble exploration, and ultimately, worship. Worship. The great mysteries of the faith were things one experienced, entered into, rather than scrutinized from afar. Here's from Newman's sermon on the Trinity. This will give you a sense of his argument. The eternal three, he writes, are worshipped by the Catholic Church as distinct yet one. The Most High God being holy the Father, and holy the Son, and holy the Holy Ghost, yet the three persons being distinct from each other, not merely in name or by human abstraction, but by very truth. Now, should anyone be tempted to say that this is dark language and difficult speculation to set before a Christian people, I answer that Christianity gives exercise to the whole mind of man, to our highest and most subtle reason, as well as to our feelings, affections, imagination, and conscience. If we find it tries us and is too severe, whether for our reason or our imagination or our feelings, let us bow down in silent adoration and submit to it, each of our faculties by turn, not complain of its sublimity or its range. For Newman, it was in the encounter with a mystery that we come to have some understanding of it, and more importantly, that we come to truly believe it. When shortly after his conversion to Catholicism, Newman and his band of young followers were looking for an expression of religious life, his first thought before he founded the Oratory was to found a new order whose main apostolate would be a life devoted to prayer and adoration of the great Christian mysteries and to preaching about them. This says something of a sense of the strategic importance for the Church of regaining a right appreciation of the mysterious and the centrality of right worship. A second but related result of liberalism in religion was a denial of things invisible. Obviously, if you make everything about empiricism, what you can touch, measure, feel, etc., most of the truths of Christianity don't apply. Angels, demons, grace, Holy Spirit, etc., because you can't see them. He would use all his descriptive talent, all his dramatic sense, and his imaginative potency to bring before the minds of his readers and hearers those things that we know to be real but cannot test empirically. God himself, the angels, the invisible world beyond visible phenomena, the sight of souls after death, the view of this world taken by the angelic hosts. He countered the reduced sight of the age by imaginatively appealing to a wider, richer, and fuller world. So 2 strategic lessons we gained from Newman in this: to counter the denial of mystery and the reality of the invisible world, right worship, regular preaching and teaching about the invisible realities themselves. I must say, I've done a lot of speaking, and I've done a lot of speaking to even college kids, and just speaking about the reality of spiritual warfare can just be completely life-changing for them. They've never thought in those terms. It's also true, by the way, as a dad. You're raising kids, and you can talk to your children as though spiritual realities are true. My son, we first moved to Colorado when I went to work for Focus, and he was afraid of sleeping in the bed. I don't know, he was 4. And it was creepy. We moved into this house. It was kind of new, and the only bed we had was a queen-size bed for him, so he's sleeping in this giant bed, which is just freaking the poor little guy out. all alone in a room. It was Greeley, Colorado, so every night smelled like cows. And so every night for the first week, he's coming into our room. And I'd pray with him. We do all that. I'm like super dad, trying to do the right thing. So finally, I gave him the super dad lecture. I said, son, you're not alone in here. You're here with, Jesus is with you. Your guardian angel, St. Bartholomew's here with you. Mary's here. The saints and angels are here with you. You're not alone. So sure enough, the next morning, he didn't come into our room that night. And I thought, I am the greatest dad in America. And I go to check on the poor guy in the morning, and he's on the edge of the bed like this. Like the whole bed he's just right on the edge. And he has this little Mary statue, this little plastic Madonna that he just was with. And I said, oh, son, I'm sorry you were scared. You were on the side of the bed. He goes, no, Dad, I'm not scared. I had to make room for all the people you told me about. In other words, I think we can unapologetically appeal to the invisible world. There are some who will see that as foolishness, but I think if we don't do that, we're not going to get to the heart of the Christian gospel, and this is certainly what Newman would say. Number 3, the necessity for a deep intellectual formation of the laity and the integration of faith and life, what you might call an education of the moral and the intellectual together. Newman was sensitive to the fact that along with a rising rationalism, there was also a number of counterfeit gospels on the rise in the Victorian age. Perhaps the most widespread in his day was the utopian belief in human perfectibility and inevitable progress. According to this view of the world, there's no such thing as a sin, and if we simply apply the practical sciences to manipulating the natural world, as well as to the social and political worlds, we can create a perfect human society, one without injustice or suffering or lack. Ideas like these, once confined to the elite institutions and coffee houses, were in Newman's day finding their way to a wider audience through the newspapers and other inexpensive publications. In order to combat these false gospels and the powerful tools of the press that were constantly pushing them, Newman insisted on the need for clarity of thought among the laity. This included an education in the sciences and other fields, but also a firm grasp of basic theology and philosophy. He insisted that the educated layman or woman needed to be well-formed in both religion and science, and this is why he spent most of his years founding schools. Rather than delve into his theory of education, I'd be happy to talk about that with you, and some of you, I'm sure, understand it better than I do. I'd like to draw out a particular observation of Newman, because I think it applies to any project we would undertake. And this is Newman's belief that one of the errors that was developing in education in his day was the separation of intellectual and moral formation, or education. That universities were treating the mind as one thing in one place, and that the moral life of the students was being treated as something entirely unrelated to it in a different space. For Newman, as for Thomas, as for the whole tradition, it was obvious that how one thinks and how one lives are connected. Therefore, in his educational endeavors, he insisted on the integration of intellectual training and moral training. This is how he put it. This is on the Feast of St. Monica, he gave a sermon on this. Quote, I wish the intellect to range with the utmost freedom. Let the intellect do its thing. And I wish religion to enjoy an equal freedom. But what I am stipulating for is that they should be found in one and the same place and exemplified in the same persons. It will not satisfy me if religion is here and science is there. I want the same roof to contain both the intellectual and moral discipline. I want the intellectual layman to be religious and the devout ecclesiastic to be intellectual. It's simply true that the separation of the intellectual and the moral in universities today has reached a pretty extreme point in many Catholic universities as well as secular ones. How this happened is a long story for another time, but the fact of the division remains. The classroom is one wholly contained sphere of influence, and the dorm room is completely separate from it. Our universities, having become hesitant to engage the moral life of students, except under the guise of something like safety, have ceased to even address, let alone answer, the deepest questions of the human heart. Questions like, why am I here? What is life, my life, for? What does it all mean? Newman's got a lesson for us here. And whether we're homeschooling, whether we're helping found schools, whether influencing the schools we're sending our kids to, whether we're part of apostolates at universities, the reintegration of the moral and intellectual is essential, I would say, for our pastoral moment. Number 4, the role of the imagination in evangelization. As important as clear thinking is to Newman, he understood that the human intellect contained both a reasoning ability and an imaginative power. Now, he had a certain understanding of the imagination that people debate. I'm just going to use it in sort of a broad sense for the purposes of my comments. The imagination was for Newman the place where we didn't simply make things up, but it was that tool we had that helped us get from a notion of something to the reality of it. You might say, to use sort of modern parlance that's a little not exactly precise, but it's how you got something to be from something in your head to something in your heart. You've probably heard this expression. Properly understood, there's a truth going on there, and this is what Newman was trying to get at. He believed that the imagination apprehended reality in a different way than mere logic, but that it was also extremely powerful. He put it this way, quote, "The heart is commonly reached," and he used hearts in sort of a Pascalian sense. "The heart is commonly reached not through the reason, but through the imagination, by means of direct impressions, by the testimony of facts and events, by history, by description. Persons influence us, voices melt us, looks subdue us, deeds inflame us. Many a man will live and die upon a dogma, no man will be a martyr for conclusion. No one, I say, will die for his own calculations, he dies for realities," end quote. So the imagination used in this sense is a tool for experiencing things and making them a concrete reality. I know in my own life, one of the big ways this applied and it affected a lot was I spent a lot of my life as a committed Catholic Christian who have tithed all my life and did various service projects, but before I actually stepped into doing getting my hands dirty and serving people in need, there was a certain notionalism to what I thought about it meant to do that. But in particular to one of these mysteries that Mother Teresa would always say that I never quite got, and I feel I get a little more now. I don't pretend to be Mother Teresa. She used to always say, "I see the face of Christ in the poor," and this is an expression we've all heard. And for her, it wasn't some sort of like neat, pious phrase. "Ooh, I see Christ in the face of the poor." She really meant it. She said, "No, is that what you saw? I saw Jesus when I saw that person." I never knew what that meant. I thought it was sort of, to use a phrase a friend of mine liked, piocious. But it wasn't. And it wasn't until I started having genuine encounters and meeting people in a place like this and spending time with them that I just got a hint, a glimpse of a mystery that she was describing. This is what Newman's getting at, that we need to, the imagination is what works with experience to take something, a truth that is notional, and make it real. Belief, he says, being concerned with things concrete, not abstract, which variously excite the mind from their moral and imaginative properties, has for its objects not only directly what is true, but inclusively what is beautiful, useful, admirable, heroic, objects which kindle devotion, rouse the passions, and attach the affections. By way of analogy, we might say something like this. In order to navigate a forest, one needs to know the smell of the earth, the sight of the path, and the feel of trees, as well as have the map to keep from getting lost and wandering off a cliff. I'd also just note, for Newman, this was not an appeal to the emotions. Newman was not, at a very young age, at the age of 15, when Newman had his first conversion experience that he described, what he said was foundational to it was when religion went to being about truth. It was about true things, about realities. That was what fundamentally changed in his mind and shaped his mind from the age of 15 on. So, while he had a place for emotion in religious life as part of the way we're made as human beings, his idea of imagination was not that. I think any of us who've been in pastoral ministry or have been in apostolic work have encountered when the emotional tends to lead the work and it always ends in shipwreck or it doesn't last. 5, the insistence on a real faith. When Newman looked at the typical religion of his time, he found people talking about faith, religion, God. In the England of his day, the society was nominally Christian and such talk was very common. But he found it to be what he called unreal. It was not a living truth that affected the whole of the character and led to a serious pattern of life, he said. He had a particular aversion as well to the use of pious phrases, not because they did not express a great truth, but because they were used so often that they became meaningless in the mouths of their speakers and hearers. So it was part of Newman's strategy to confront this head on, to ask of his hearers that they assess honestly, without equivocation, whether their faith was real, whether it actually affected the way they lived, or was just something they were happy to talk about. Here's a sample from a famous sermon of his called Ventures of Faith. He writes, "If then faith be the essence of a Christian life, it follows that our duties lies in risking upon Christ's word all that we have for what we have not, and doing so in a noble, generous way, not indeed rashly or lightly. Let everyone who hears me ask himself the question." Now, this is one of his sermons that he's giving at the University of Mary. It's packed. This is the Oxford University. And there's a balcony that would have been at his height. So it was the people in the balcony who could see, because Newman's speaking from a podium. So they're looking right at him. And he's saying this right to these undergraduates and the people who are in the pews. He says, "Let everyone who hears me ask himself the question, what stake has he in the truth of Christ's promise? How would he be a whit the worse off, supposing, which is impossible, but supposing Christ's promises to fail? This is the question. What have we ventured? I really fear that most men called Christians, whatever they may profess, whatever they may think they feel, whatever warmth and illumination and love they may claim as their own, yet would go on almost as they do, neither much better nor much worse, if they believed Christianity to be a fable." End quote. This was the kind of piercing soul-searching that Newman was famous for. He'd have people scrutinize yourself. If you ever read a Newman sermon, and I'd encourage you to do it, his prose style comes from Cicero, which makes for some very long sentences, but if you get in there, you can get through it. He would probe you. And you read a Newman sermon, you start it, and you're like, he's describing a certain kind of moral weakness or failure in a Christian. He's not going after, he's kind of, and you're going, I'm not that. Yeah, I'm not that. And then he starts explicating. And he'll say, some of you may be thinking, I mean this. I actually mean this. And then you begin to find yourself, at least this reader does. And by the end of the thing, you're thinking, oh, he's got me. This was, Newman believed, essential. You had to break people of their illusions, particularly those for whom Christianity might be something easy to talk about or simply live as a culture. But here's the flip side of that. He always did that in order to set people clearly in their minds because he believed they had a great mission. When Newman was quite sick in Sicily and everyone thought he was going to die, there's probably cholera he had. He said at one point, he wrote in his diary, and he would have died had his guide not been there to take care of him, he said, "I will not die because I have not sinned against the light, and yet I have a great work to do when I get back to England." And he believed that every human being's mission was such that if you could break down the false pride, the false humility, if you could get to the core of the human being, you were actually setting them free for their destiny. So it wasn't just to beat people up. Quite the contrary. It was to set them free from their own weakness in order to do great things. My conclusion. Despite his evident, rather stark assessment of the challenges of the modern world and his foreboding about the coming infidelity, Newman was not discouraged personally by what he saw. He, like the saints before and after him, was a fighter. As he wrote, "I have no hesitation in saying that I prefer to live in an age when the fight is in the day, not in the twilight. It is the one great advantage of an age in which unbelief speaks out, that faith can speak out too. That if falsehood assails truth, truth can assail falsehood." In the end, Newman's strategic vision was pretty simple: to love and serve the truth. Thus he sought to know it, to speak it plainly and imaginatively and with conviction. He sought to live it openly and courageously, without belligerence or show, but nonetheless with joy and without apology. Newman's age was consumed with the immediate and the visible. He insisted on remembering the hidden and the invisible. It was thrilled by the promise of material progress and held an exalted view of human rationality. He constantly remembered the reality of sin and the danger of pride. His age looked at Christianity as at best a personal opinion or sentiment. He declared that it was hard, solid truth. It was steeped in the anti-Catholicism of centuries. He breathed new life into the Catholic mysteries and the sacramental imagination, and did the unforgivable for an English gentleman of becoming a Catholic. It regarded itself as a morally Christian civilization. He saw that the claim was hollow, and that a time was coming when it would crumble in the face of atheistic materialism. In these and in many other ways, Newman was out of step with his time. He was out of step with his time. But the very reasons so many did not understand him or sympathize him with his cause are the reasons why he has so much to say to us. Whatever was true of the waning of genuine Christianity in Victorian England is far truer of our own time. Newman's voice gains in resonance as the year goes by. We would be wise to listen to him and imitate him, especially in his willingness with all the saints to venture all for Christ. Thank you.
That's great. Really appreciate it. So we do have just got a couple signs with microphones. Okay, we do have some time for questions, and I think there are two seminarians in the back with microphones. So if you would indicate your question, one of them will come your direction.
Thank you, Doctor, for coming to speak with us this evening. I have a quick question about a dichotomy that I was picking up on between the intellect and morality. And I was wondering what you were proposing that St. John Henry Newman, as a tactician and strategist, proposed for our modern times, how to marry those two, and if you were proposing his theory in resurging and attending to mystery as maybe a pedagogy for that. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, great question. There's a long answer to this, and I'll give a short version of it. So John Henry Newman envisioned the reinvigoration of what was the college system. So in the English university, as many of you know, there's a university which is a collection of colleges. And the college is where the student actually lived. And you lived in residence with other students, and this is where the tutor was. And the job of the tutor that he was trying to reinvigorate was precisely to reinfuse in that college system a ordered life, a sense of moral shared life together, etc., so that your living experience was incarnating the very truths you were encountering in the classroom. So his practical solution was to reinvigorate colleges. And if you're interested in this, a nice explication of it is less in the idea of a university than in his sermons on colleges and universities, one specifically on colleges and universities. So he wanted to make the living experience of the student not some random thing where you kind of kept safe, but an actual ordered life together. That was meant to be reasonable. He wasn't trying to make them monks. He's just trying to help form them. In terms of the pedagogy of mystery, absolutely, this is where Newman insisted on the liturgical life as being the heart of that shared life together. Because it was in that encounter that the mind is actually being shaped, and as many have said much smarter than myself, the liturgy itself is pedagogical. It's teaching us, it's disciplining us, that we submit to the liturgy, it doesn't submit to us, obviously. So, thank you. No, exactly.
Thank you very much for your talk, Doctor. I enjoyed it immensely. In your long experience in various facets of the church, in your view, are these principles and approach of Newman guiding people today, or is this more of an exhortation that they do so?
They're in different places to different degrees. So I would say, and I genuinely believe this, that there are a number of great gifts being manifest. For example, in one area, let's take campus ministry type things. So the Thomistic Institute, which you guys are doing, extremely oriented towards the intellectual and the life in a way that's a great gift to the church. Focus very much towards evangelization, basic preaching of the Kerygma. Although they do have shared life together, they actually have a vision of colleges and focus in that. So I would just say there are pieces of it out there. One of my great friends and dear friends who passed away, who I just should acknowledge, is Don Briel, who started the first Catholic Studies program at the University of St. Thomas, was a dear friend, recently passed. His vision of what Catholic Studies is doing at the University of St. Thomas, very Newmanian in that particular space. There's liturgical renewal, there's all those things. So I'm just seeing different places. It's almost like a number of things are rising up, let's call them green shoots in the church, that it's too strong a word for it, but that have a certain charism in a given place in this. But I would argue that all the successful movements need to in some way take these principles seriously, even if it's not the major thing they emphasize. That's at least what I'm advocating for. Whether that's true or not, others can decide. Yeah.
Doctor, it was on this very campus that many of us heard about John Henry, Cardinal Newman, and especially I was waiting for the great quote, which may have come from Chesterton, that the Oxford movement was the bow that broke when it had released the flashing arrow that was Newman. We heard that in 1962. That was the last we heard of John Henry Newman. You know what happened in '62, the great distraction, huh? We've all been Vaticanists ever since. But in any case, somehow, here we are. It's 50 years later, 55, and where do we start? Where would my generation start if I had this whole library of Newman work and no idea where to start first?
Great question, and there's more than one way to answer that depending on the person. But if you've never read Newman, here's an interesting story. The great philosopher Wittgenstein, this has a point, I promise. Apparently on his deathbed, Edith Ascombe was with him, and his reading before he died was the plain and parochial sermons of John Henry Newman. That was what he was reading. They actually asked him, would you like to see a priest before he died? He said, yes, but not a philosopher. The sermons are fantastic. They take a little work. The prose is a little bit of work because it is Ciceronian, so it's clause after dependent clause after. It's beautiful once you get the rhythm. I think so. But the sermons are one way in. If you've never read anything in Newman, you're not sure what to do, you might climb in that way. If you have a particular question you want to ask that Newman addressed in a way that contemporaries are talking, so say the two areas where he's often cited are around the notion of conscience and also obviously the development of doctrine, given certain conversations, then you might start with the essay on development of doctrine. If you care about universities, I'd actually start with the university sermons before I went to the idea of a university. University sermons are a little more earthy, a little more grounded. You get a sense of what he's talking about, a little more historical, and then you get the ideas he put in the idea of a university. And then if you're really ambitious and love obscure questions on faith and reason and new words that he invented, you can read A Grammar of Assent. But I would climb in that way. And if you're looking for a book on Newman, there's so many. There's so many writings on Newman, but a few that I have found personally deeply moving as a biography of just to get a hold of the man. Some people would call it hagiographical, but I love it. Is by Meriol Trevor, Meriol Trevor. The great intellectual, probably the best intellectual biography of Newman is by Ian Carr, K-E-R, I would suggest. So those are some areas you might start. But the sermons are a great place to start, and start right at the beginning. Because they changed England. They made him the most influential man in England for a period of time were his sermons. Great question.
Thank you, Dr. Reyes, for your presentation. I have a question. You brought up something that I found very interesting, because I've heard that Newman's lifetime spans pretty much the entirety of the 19th century. He's born early 1800s, dies 1890s. And you brought up the fact of the French Revolution. How do you suspect or believe or appreciate what the French Revolution taking place in his childhood, Napoleon's rise, the closest thing to a world war that the world had seen at that sense, like all of the war going on in Europe. How do you think this impacted his ability to see liberalism for what it was and to see what it? I was wondering if you could speak about that.
Yeah, if I understand, I'll try to what I think the question is, and then so in the French Revolution, Newman saw what atheism looked like as a religious belief, as a kind of religious commitment. So he knew its potency. So then, what I was sort of hinting at in the lecture, what Newman would then say is, where does this come from? And so he was digging down the French Revolution to first principles. And that's when he started to identify what many historians have since identified and were identifying at the time and arguing about, was a sort of fundamental core first principles that he felt were where the problem was. A scientistic, not scientific, scientistic, that is reducing all things to the empirical, a belief in progress, the perfectibility of human beings, Auguste Comte, these guys. Newman saw these, and what was different about Newman is they didn't just seem like weird ideas out there. He actually saw them as potencies. He saw that they were dangerous to believe. But the other place he saw the, quote, liberalism in religion that he was describing, which is not directly related to the French Revolution, but I should point out, was in biblical scholarship. So he was very aware of what was going on in Germany at the time and the kinds of questions that were being raised about whether interpretation of Scripture and whether it was a reliable source. And he even says in afterward, I believe it's in the afterword of the Apologia, that he understood why a lot of his friends didn't become Catholic, even though he did. He said because they couldn't see coming yet what he could, which was that the Bible as the grounding of faith wasn't going to live through German biblical criticism. And he just said people couldn't quite see that when he could. And so that's where the other source of his anxiety about liberalism and religion came from. Great question. Thank you.
For Cardinal Newman, where did he see that the greatest place to combat this liberalism, to combat it, where would that be?
Where would he see that fight as being
Most effective?
Oh, education. Definitely, institutions of education. That's what he was all about, the formation of lay life. He tried to buoy up the Anglican Church. He had the remarkably strange position of making radical arguments and many enemies in the process in arguing that the Anglican bishops had apostolic succession and so shouldn't let the state push them around. He was making that argument when the Anglican bishops didn't actually believe it. So that was what he got caught in. So then he turned largely to education, formation in life, common life. The oratory was a key piece of this. As you know about St. Philip's vision of an oratory, it has an intellectual dimension to it, very much so. So yeah, education would be the fundamental place for that cultural shift.
Thank you, Doctor. Just a little bit speculative, but just in light of the fact that you said that Cardinal Newman emphasized the mystery, the sense of mystery in the faith, what do you think he would have thought of the development in the liturgy of the Novus Ordo Mass and the kind of more recent Summorum Pontificum, the kind of increase in returning to some of the tradition of the Mass? What kind of take do you think he would have liturgically on those developments?
Yeah, no, fair question. And if it sounds like I'm going to try to dodge it because of the issues there, it's because I am. No. The person who's had a sort of intelligence, the person who I've trusted in trying to speculate on that question, and frankly, Vatican II and some other questions like this, is Ian Carr. And he wrote a wonderful little book called Newman and Vatican II. And I strongly recommend it to you as someone who really knows Newman mind, trying to answer those questions. And of course, he had things to say about where liturgy is downplaying mystery, this is not a good thing. So, but for a really developed answer to that, I'd recommend Ian Carr's book, Newman in Vatican II. It's short, it's not that long, and it like takes each of these sort of, some of the contemporary issues that are being kicked around and tries to use Newman to see them. Great question.
Dr. Reyes, thank you. What aspects of Newman's interior life, his life of prayer, do you know of, or at least appear to you from what you've read of him, that stand out to you?
Like all the saints, any number of things you could point to. Can I just add a piece about Newman and that to me is deeply moving, maybe because it was, it's just because we all have our own biography, right? I did not know the Newman who spent 3 to 4 hours a day in Birmingham in the confessional for poor Irish immigrants and literally unwashed. I use that on purpose because he described that the smell in the confessional would get so strong it would be hard to be in it. And here's the beauty of Newman in his own language of reality and unreality. I know you asked interior life, but I think this is related to it. Serving the poor keeps your feet on the ground. And for someone of Newman's intellectual potency, the danger that can to run to pride, which was Newman's great fear. It was a great fear of his own life. If you read his journals, he says, when I was in danger, it was when I was prideful, because he was always the best student, one exception when he failed a test, but that was an anxiety, a breakdown. He was always, and what he realized early in his life was the greatest temptation for a man of his intellect was pride. That was a sin of his age, and one of the ways to combat it, if not the best way to combat it, was to a living life of apostolic service to those most in need. And I have found that to be deeply, deeply moving for me personally. Thank you for asking. And thank you all for being here and for the time to be with you. God bless.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening for our presentation, and please do linger for coffee and cookies, and I'm sure Dr. Reyes will remain for a little while longer. Thanks.